The Tonight Show studio was alive with its Thursday night energy when Frank Williams walked onto the stage, his weathered hands clasped behind his back and his posture reflecting 35 years of carrying mailbags through rain, snow, and scorching heat. At 62, Frank moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had walked the same neighborhood routes for decades, his kind eyes taking in the studio audience with the same careful attention he'd given to every house on his postal route. Jimmy Fallon stood to greet him, immediately struck by Frank's humble demeanor and the way he seemed almost surprised to be there. Frank wore his best button-down shirt and slacks, clothes that were clearly reserved for special occasions, and carried a worn leather satchel that had obviously seen years of faithful service. "Frank Williams, everyone," Jimmy announced as the audience applauded warmly. Frank just retired after 35 years as a postal worker, delivering mail to the same neighborhoods in Portland, Oregon. "Frank, welcome to the show." Frank settled into the guest chair with a slight smile, looking out at the audience with genuine wonder. "Thank you for having me, Jimmy. I have to say, this is a lot more exciting than my usual Thursday routine of sorting catalogs and pension checks." The audience chuckled, and Jimmy leaned forward with interest. 35 years in the same neighborhoods. That's incredible. You must have some amazing stories from all those years on the job." Frank's expression grew thoughtful, and he placed his hands on the satchel in his lap. "You know, Jimmy, most people think being a mailman is pretty straightforward. Pick up mail, sort mail, deliver mail, go home, and for a long time I thought that too. But somewhere along the way I realized my job was about much more than delivering letters and packages." "What do you mean?" Jimmy asked, sensing there was something deeper behind Frank's words. Frank was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to share. "Well, when you walk the same streets every day for decades, you start to notice things, patterns, changes. You begin to really see the people whose mail you're delivering not just as names on mailboxes, but as human beings with real lives, real struggles, real needs." The studio grew quieter, the audience picking up on the sincerity in Frank's voice. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, giving Frank space to continue. "About 15 years ago, I had this elderly woman on my route, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. Sweet lady, lived alone in this little blue house on Maple Street every day. I'd deliver her mail, and she'd always wave from her window, sometimes come out to chat about the weather or ask about my family." Frank's voice took on a warmer tone as he recalled the memory. "But one week I noticed something different. Her mailbox was getting full, really full. She hadn't been collecting her mail for about 4 days, which wasn't like her at all. The newspapers were piling up on her porch, and I hadn't seen her at the window." Jimmy felt a chill of anticipation, sensing this story was going somewhere important. "Now, technically, I'm just supposed to deliver the mail and move on," Frank continued, "but something in my gut told me this wasn't right, so I knocked on her door. No answer. I could hear her television playing inside, but no movement. I tried calling through the mail slot, and finally heard this very weak voice calling for help." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word of Frank's story. Long story short, Mrs. Patterson had fallen and broken her hip 3 days earlier. She couldn't reach her phone, couldn't get to the door. If I hadn't noticed the pattern, change in her mail routine, she might have... Frank's voice trailed off, the implication clear. "Frank, that's incredible," Jimmy said softly. "You saved her life just by paying attention." Frank nodded modestly. "That's when I realized that my real job wasn't just delivering mail. I was often the only person who visited these houses every single day. I was in a unique position to notice when something was wrong." Jimmy leaned forward, intrigued. "Did that change how you approached your job?" Frank's face lit up with a mixture of pride and humility. "It changed everything, Jimmy. I started paying attention differently. I began to notice when elderly people on my route hadn't collected their mail for more than 2 days, when someone who usually kept their porch tidy suddenly had newspapers piling up, when prescription bottles sat in mailboxes longer than usual. He opened his leather satchel and pulled out a worn notebook. I even started keeping track, not in any official capacity, you understand. This was just my personal mission. I'd make note of who lived alone, who might be vulnerable, who had patterns that I should watch for. Jimmy looked at the notebook with amazement. Frank, are you telling us that you basically became an unofficial neighborhood watchman? I prefer to think of it as being a good neighbor, Frank replied with a gentle smile. Over the years, I've called for wellness checks on probably 24 people. Sometimes it was nothing. They were just visiting family or had gone on vacation without thinking to hold their mail. But other times, Frank's expression grew more serious. Other times, I found people who had medical emergencies, who had fallen, who were having mental health crises, who were just isolated and needed someone to check on them. I've called ambulances, contacted family members, even sat with people until help arrived. The studio audience began to murmur in amazement, and Jimmy felt tears prick his eyes. Frank, how many people do you think you've helped over the years? Frank considered the question carefully. If we're talking about serious situations where someone really needed immediate help, I'd say maybe 15 or 20 people. But if we're talking about smaller kindnesses, delivering medicine to someone who couldn't get to their mailbox, helping elderly folks with heavy packages, just being a friendly face on a lonely day, well, that number would be much higher. Jimmy shook his head in wonder. And you never told anyone about this? Your supervisors, the media, anyone? Who was I going to tell? Frank asked with genuine confusion. I was just doing what felt right. Besides, these weren't strangers to me anymore. After delivering mail to the same houses for years, these people became part of my extended family. You look out for family. Jimmy turned to address the camera directly. Ladies and gentlemen, we're sitting here with a man who has quietly been a hero for 15 years, and he doesn't even think what he did was that special. Frank looked uncomfortable with the praise. Jimmy, I think you're making this sound more dramatic than it really was. I was already walking by these houses every day anyway. It just made sense to pay attention. But Frank, Jimmy pressed gently, most people wouldn't have noticed those patterns. Most people wouldn't have taken the time to check on their neighbors. And most people certainly wouldn't have kept it up for 15 years without any recognition or reward. Frank was quiet for a moment, then reached into his satchel again and pulled out a small bundle of letters and cards. Actually, I did get rewards. The best kind of rewards. He held up the bundle. These are thank you notes from people I helped over the years and from their families. Mrs. Patterson sent me a Christmas card every year until she passed away 5 years ago, always thanking me for saving her life with kindness. Mr. Rodriguez wrote to tell me that the day I noticed his mail piling up and called for a wellness check, I found him during a diabetic emergency that could have been fatal. Frank's voice grew emotional as he continued. This one is from the daughter of Mrs. Chen, thanking me for being the one to discover that her mother was having a stroke. This one is from Mr. Thompson's son, saying that I gave his family 3 extra years with their father because I noticed he wasn't collecting his medications and got him the help he needed. Jimmy wiped his eyes, no longer caring about maintaining his composure on national television. Frank, do you realize what you've done? You've basically been a guardian angel for an entire neighborhood. Frank smiled, tears beginning to form in his own eyes. I realized something over the years, Jimmy. My job title said I was delivering mail, but what I was really delivering was hope. I was delivering the message that someone cared enough to notice. Someone was paying attention. Someone would help if needed. The audience began to applaud, but it was different from typical television applause. This was the sound of people recognizing something genuinely heroic, something that restored their faith in human goodness. "Tell me about your last day on the job," Jimmy said. "What was that like?" Frank's expression grew bittersweet. "My last day was about 3 weeks ago. I have to admit, I was worried about the people on my route. Who was going to notice if Mrs. Garcia's mail started piling up? Who would check on Mr. Williams if his newspaper sat on his porch for too many days?" He paused, then smiled. "But you know what happened on my last day? The whole neighborhood came out to say goodbye. People I had helped over the years, people whose mail I had delivered, kids who had grown up seeing me walk by their houses every day, and they had organized themselves into an informal network to look out for each other." Jimmy leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Garcia promised to check on Mr. Williams every few days. The young couple on Oak Street said they'd keep an eye on the elderly folks nearby. Mr. Rodriguez, who I had helped years ago, said he was going to take daily walks through the neighborhood and pay attention to the same things I had been watching for." Frank's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "I realized that day that I hadn't just been delivering mail and helping people. I had been modeling what it looks like to be a good neighbor, and that example had spread throughout the community." The studio was completely silent now, everyone absorbed in Frank's story. Jimmy felt like he was in the presence of someone who had discovered one of life's most important truths. "Frank," Jimmy said softly, "what would you say to people watching this who want to make a difference but don't think they have the opportunity or the platform to help others?" Frank looked directly into the camera, his expression serious but kind. "I'd say that you don't need a platform or a title or special training to be a hero. You just need to pay attention to the people around you. Notice when someone's routine changes. Notice when someone seems lonely or struggling. Notice when someone might need help." He held up his worn notebook again. "This isn't fancy technology or a complicated system. This is just one person deciding to care about his neighbors and keeping track of that caring in a regular notebook. Anyone can do this." Frank's voice grew more passionate. "We all have people in our daily lives, neighbors, co-workers, people we see regularly at the grocery store or the gym or the coffee shop. If we just pay attention, if we just care enough to notice patterns and changes, we can all be the person who notices when someone needs help." Jimmy nodded, deeply moved by Frank's words. "What's next for you, Frank? Now that you're retired?" Frank smiled with obvious excitement. "Well, I'm not done helping people, if that's what you're asking. I've volunteered with the local senior center to do welfare checks on isolated elderly folks. I'm also working with the postal service to train new mail carriers about the importance of community awareness." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with purpose. "I want other postal workers to understand that they're not just delivering mail. They're in a unique position to be the eyes and ears of their communities. They can be the person who notices when something's wrong and gets help for people who need it." Jimmy turned to address the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, Frank Williams just taught us something incredibly important. Heroism isn't about dramatic rescues or superhuman abilities. It's about paying attention, caring about our neighbors, and being willing to act when we notice someone needs help." As the segment continued, Frank shared more stories of the small kindnesses and major interventions that had defined his postal career. He talked about the Christmas morning when he delivered presents to a family whose father had been laid off, packages sent anonymously by neighbors who wanted to help. He described the time he helped coordinate a surprise birthday party for an elderly woman who had no family nearby, organizing the entire neighborhood through the connections he had built over the years. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, Frank didn't immediately leave the stage. He sat with Jimmy for another hour, sharing more stories and talking about his philosophy of community care. "You know, Jimmy," Frank said as they talked, I think a lot of people feel powerless to make a real difference in the world. They see big problems and think they need big solutions. But what I learned over 35 years is that the world changes one neighbor at a time, one act of attention at a time, one moment of caring at a time. Jimmy nodded, profoundly moved by his conversation with Frank. You've certainly changed my perspective on what it means to be a good neighbor. In the weeks following Frank's appearance, something remarkable happened. The Tonight Show received thousands of emails from viewers sharing their own stories of paying attention to their neighbors, of small acts of kindness that had made big differences, of communities coming together to look out for each other. Postal workers across the country began implementing informal versions of Frank's system, paying closer attention to their routes, and the people they served, community organizations, started neighborhood watch programs focused not just on crime prevention, but on general welfare and support for vulnerable residents. Frank's story sparked a national conversation about the importance of community connection and the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary differences through simple acts of attention and care. 6 months later, Frank received a letter from the Postmaster General, commending him for his service and announcing that the Postal Service would be implementing a nationwide community awareness training program. Based on his example, the program would teach mail carriers how to recognize signs that residents might need help and how to connect them with appropriate resources. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from his old neighborhood in Portland. The city officially renamed the street where Frank had worked for 35 years to Frank Williams Way, with a plaque that read, "In honor of a mailman who delivered more than mail, he delivered hope, help, and the reminder that someone always cares." Frank's leather satchel, the one he brought to the Tonight Show, was donated to the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, not because it was historically significant, but because it represented something important about American values. The idea that ordinary people doing ordinary jobs can choose to be extraordinary in their care for others. That Thursday night, when Frank Williams shared his story of quiet heroism with millions of viewers, he reminded everyone that the most important delivery we can make is the daily choice to notice each other, to care about each other, and to act when someone needs help. He proved that you don't need a cape to be a superhero. Sometimes all you need is a mailbag, a notebook, and a heart big enough to hold an entire neighborhood's worth of caring.